It goes without saying that it's good to have your own opinion. Whilst game critics can set the hype up with their previews of hotly anticipated titles, it's worth going in as unbiased as possible to see how you really feel. The following titles were all lauded by the press, but when they hit the shelves, the public couldn't unanimously agree. Some absolutely loved these games, some despised them, and many fell somewhere in between. Because I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 video games critics loved that immediately divided fans. Number 10, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Link's Wii outing received glowing reviews across the board and was the 16th game ever to receive a perfect score in Japanese magazine Famitsu. Critics raved over the Wii Motion Plus peripheral, which enabled Link to perform precise movements with his sword and shield, allowing for more immersive battles and puzzles. However, Nintendo fans couldn't see eye to eye with critics, especially when it came to Skyward Sword's unique controller. Many gamers found the Wii Motion Plus imprecise, impairing their ability to perform the simplest tasks, and when the controller was required for complex puzzles, players were in serious trouble. Even if the peripheral wasn't an issue, Skyward Sword has many other problems, including filler side quests, an infuriating final dungeon, and a sidekick that's so annoying she makes Navi seem tolerable. When Skyward Sword was remastered for the Switch, it was the perfect time to reassess it. Since the gaming community preemptively hated on Wind Waker, it was possible that some players had jumped the gun once again. And although some issues were fixed in the remaster, for example, Fee shuts up now, many glaring problems were still apparent, reaffirming the fact that Skyward Sword was a misfire. Number 9, Street Fighter 6. Street Fighter 6 wasn't just a success, but a return to form for Capcom's opulent fighting saga. The franchise's latest outing boasts a detailed character creator feature, a diverse online mode, and a vast open world to explore. Then there's the fighting. Even though Street Fighter's combat system never needed to be reinvented, the drive system enhanced battles in a way nobody had seen before. Street Fighter 6 also incorporates a unique arrangement that allowed blind and sight-impaired gamers to play, proving Capcom had gone above and beyond to satisfy their audience. Despite boasting a Metacritic score of 92, Street Fighter 6's user rating was far less positive. And although it's no secret Street Fighter suffered the wrath of trolls, many complaints were completely fair. The sudden texture dips make the characters momentarily look like they belong in a PS2 game. The main campaign encourages grinding, making the gameplay repetitive. Fans were disappointed by the absence of iconic fighters such as M. Bison, Vega and Sagat, none of which are guaranteed to be included in the future. And there was such backlash on the game's reliance on overpriced DLC that Capcom was compelled to address the issue on Twitter. Street Fighter 6 is still an absolutely stellar title, but it looks like the critics didn't address key issues in their initial assessments. Number 8, Halo 4. It's difficult to criticise Halo 4 without sounding like a nitpicker. While analysing the graphics, gunplay, animations and pacing individually, it's tough to find fault. The campaign is tightly packed and demonstrates a tremendous variety in gameplay. The development between Master Chief and Cortana's relationship deserves special mention since their deep bond serves as the heart of the overarching narrative. So what's the problem then? Well, Halo up until that point had been a franchise that managed to outdo itself over and over, but this time around it felt like the bar hadn't been raised. And at the same time, changing hands from Bungie to 343 Industries meant that some things got lost along the way. For example, the music in Halo 4 is good in its own right, great even, but because it doesn't contain the Gregorian chanting and that guitar riff that fans were used to, it loses a trademark familiarity. Similarly, the same could be said about some of the visual design. Disgruntled fans argue, with decent merit, that Halo 4 traded in a very specific alien visual style for something that is a tad more generic. The core gameplay felt kind of samey in places, and where it did evolve, it was easy to argue that it was in the wrong direction, as the game took cues from the success of the Call of Duty school of shooters, something that later entries walked back to give Halo its arcadey feel back. As such, Halo 4 continues to feel like a very odd title in the franchise that still divides opinion. Number 7, Doom 3. Doom 3 received a Metacritic score of 88%, with reviews applauding its lifelike graphics, tense atmosphere, and focus on story. However, many gamers had such an aversion to this threequel, it sounded like they were complaining about a completely different IP. Players find it frustrating how our hero is unable to hold his weapon and his flashlight simultaneously. Because of this, the player often has to decide between being armed or being able to see. Whilst it's meant to increase horror in some aspects, this mechanic is extra irritating since nearly every level is shrouded in darkness. Gamers gamers spend so much time whipping out and putting away their torch, it ruins the immersion. But Doom 3's biggest problem is the fact that it doesn't feel like Doom. Rather than encouraging the player to explore in an open world, this installment has a relatively linear level design. Doom has always benefited from its minimal structure, so it amplifies the chaos when the player encounters demons from all directions. But since Doom 3 has the protagonist following a set path, this unpredictable element is absent. Even though critics were on board with Doom 3's changes, id Software took fans' criticism on board, going back to the basics for its 2016 follow-up. Number 6, Destiny 2. Fixing many issues of its predecessor, Destiny 2 was perceived as everything the first installment should have been. The Bungie sequel had a more accessible storyline, taught gunplay, and some fleshed out villains. Although Destiny 2 took a step in the right direction, a closer examination reveals that much of the hype was unwarranted. While the gameplay mechanics are serviceable, many fans felt that they became routine after a while. The vast majority of missions, especially the lost sectors, can be boiled down to the same formula. Go here, defeat enemies, and fetch an item or activate a device. The lack of variety within the missions and objectives diminishes the overall experience, leading to a repetitive grind that quickly becomes tiresome. Overall, Destiny 2 shares so many similarities with its precursor that to many it feels more like a DLC or a revision. It's no wonder it's earned the moniker Destiny 1.5. Sadly, the pay-to-win gameplay from the previous entry has been amped up, destroying any sense of skill-based progression. Because many players had a major gripe with this unbalanced system, it's bewildering the developers decided to keep it for the sequel at all. Number 5, Super Mario Sunshine. It's difficult to comprehend the impact Super Mario 64 had on the video game industry. Not only was it a marvellous game in its own right, it showcased the power of the Nintendo 64 and proved that 3D platformers could work at all. So when Nintendo released the follow-up, Super Mario Sunshine, no one was surprised by the overwhelming reception it received. Revered as better than Mario 64 by multiple critics, fans couldn't wait to experience the Goomba-stomping plumber's latest caper. But Mario Sunshine is not remembered in the best light. Even though Mario's Flood backpack and its water mechanics were a refreshing change of pace, it was also a factor that many gamers took umbrage with. Although Mario has always been renowned for its simplicity and precision, using Flood doesn't always come easy. Ironically, the sections where Mario loses his backpack were lauded by many since they focused on purely old-school platforming. But that's not all. Some sections and puzzles feel rushed and unpolished, especially the final boss, who can be defeated in 30 seconds. Despite the fact that Super Mario 64 pioneered the 3D camera system, it's widely inconsistent this time around. Fortunately, whether people loved or hated Super Mario Sunshine, most people agree that Nintendo got back on track with the next game, Super Mario Galaxy. But because of this, Sunshine feels like an odd blemish in the franchise's otherwise spotless record. Number 4, Final Fantasy XVI. At one point, the release of the next Final Fantasy was a cause for celebration since nearly every installment was considered a masterpiece. Unfortunately, Square Enix has had quite a few duds recently, and not just within the Final Fantasy sphere. As such, fans have become a bit more cautionary. But based on the initial impressions of Final Fantasy XVI, such concerns seemed unsanctioned. The customizable combat mechanics offer players an endlessly engaging battle system. Masayoshi Soken returns to score, once again composing yet another magnificent soundtrack. Even though it feels redundant to praise the visuals, the way Final Fantasy XVI merges fantastical elements into a photorealistic aesthetic makes every frame look magnificent. However, purists might be turned off since FF16 has done away with multiple staples, including MP, elemental strengths and weaknesses, and a party of characters to play as. Even though the combat is bombastically creative, it definitely feels closer to Devil May Cry than Final Fantasy. To some gamers, these alterations shouldn't be a problem whatsoever, but because Final Fantasy XVI has made a lot of key changes to a long-standing series, veterans of the franchise may struggle to recognise it as Final Fantasy at all. Number 3, Deathloop. Even though Deathloop was initially hailed as an innovative and mind-bending gaming experience, the gaming community quickly turned on Arcane Studios' chrono-weaving FPS. Ironically, the sandbox shooter's most common criticism resides within its premise. Because the missions revolve around completing the same objectives repeatedly, it's only a matter of time, before the monotony sets in. Despite the game's attempt to maintain variety through different areas and enemy encounters, the repetitive nature of the gameplay ultimately becomes tiresome. Once players have completed the story and explored the intricacies of each loop, the game loses its appeal, leading to a lack of long-term engagement. Although Deathloop was meant to represent next-gen tech, it suffers from quite a few technical glitches. Because of the level of precision required throughout each mission, frame rate drops and performance issues heavily impair the immersion. Now that's not suggesting Deathloop isn't worth checking out. As the player memorises the enemy patterns upon each loop, it's empowering to wipe the floor with them with little effort. Also, the invasion mechanic is ingenious and it keeps players on their toes during each campaign. Nevertheless, Deathloop is not the showstopper we were led to believe. Number 2, Heavy Rain. Even though critics acted like Quantum Dream's detective thriller Heavy Rain was without fault, gamers proved it was anything but. Despite the melancholic tone and tragic story, Heavy Rain has plenty of unintentionally funny moments, including Ethan's Matrix-like leap to save his son, the Sean glitch, or the Jason mall scene. Though Heavy Rain focuses on creating a deeply emotional and complex narrative, multiple plot holes, inconsistent accents, and poor voice acting stops players from getting fully invested. Also, many flaws in the gameplay and plot are more apparent when Heavy Rain is revisited. Having to perform quick-time events to execute menial tasks becomes laborious on multiple playthroughs. Watching Ethan brush his teeth or microwave a pizza is even less interesting the second time around. While playing the main campaign for a second time, it's clear that some subplots have no payoff, especially Ethan's blackouts. Because Ethan's spells are never explained, it's obvious they were inserted into the plot solely to cast doubt over the origami killer's identity. Although Heavy Rain was praised by critics for its storytelling, Ethan's blackouts felt like the kind of laziest red herring possible. And number 1, The Last of Us Part 2. Considering The Last of Us Part 2 won over 320 Game of the Year awards, it seemed like the last video game to generate outrage, especially since its predecessor was universally adored. And yet Naughty Dog's hyped follow-up garnered an unprecedented level of hatred. Although Part 2's review bombing was deeply unfair, many of the game's criticisms were worth talking about. The sequel tries so hard to subvert expectations that many feel it interferes with the characterization and the flow of the narrative. As a concept, it was clever to allow gamers to play as Abby since it let them see things from the antagonist's point of view. However, it could be argued that so much time is dedicated to Abby's backstory that it takes away from Ellie, who's supposed to be the protagonist. Even though Joel's death was meant to be devastating, and it was, to many gamers it felt like a betrayal since they barely spent an hour with him. Although flashbacks are a great tool at fleshing out details, many of the interjected sequences ended up undermining the story. Some fans feel the characterization is surprisingly underdeveloped to the point where key figures perform actions that contradict their value. And on the other side of the fence, The Last of Us 2 is still today being heralded as one of the best storylines in gaming, with some of the most fleshed out characters of all time. If you were to look back through the last 50 years of video games and pick one title that people can't agree on, it most certainly is The Last of Us Part 2. Speaking of The Last of Us, do you remember the reveal for The Day Before, which was meant to be some kind of crossover between The Last of Us and Division? You probably don't believe that that game actually still exists, or at least as far as we know, so check out this list on screen now for 9 video games that definitely exist. Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment down below on more video games that divided opinion despite the critics loving them. You can head over to WhatCulture.com for more content every day. I've been Si for WhatCulture, and have a good week.